In the quiet of her beloved Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria faced the one fate she had long feared, but never truly prepared for. On January 22, 1901, the woman who had sat on the throne of Britain for over 63 years lay frail, fading, and surrounded by a family who refused to imagine a world without her. She was 81 years old, her reign the longest the nation had ever known, and her death would not simply end a life, it would shatter an age. To her people, Victoria had become less a queen than a permanent fixture, a presence so enduring that many believed she could not die at all. But behind the heavy curtains of her Osborne chamber, reality intruded. Her health was broken, her mind clouded, and the weight of grief that had stalked her since the death of Prince Albert half a century earlier pressed more heavily than ever. The final years of her life were not triumphant. They were years of sorrow, loss, and the slow collapse of a monarch once seen as unshakable. The year 1900, her last full year on Earth, was cruel. Far from the pomp of her Jubilee celebrations, she found herself tormented by personal tragedy and the anxieties of empire. In South Africa, the Boer War dragged on in blood and humiliation, with news of British defeats and casualties landing on her desk like hammer blows. Even closer to her heart, disaster struck her family again and again. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, narrowly escaped death in Belgium when a young anarchist attempted to assassinate him. Her daughter, Victoria, Empress Frederick of Germany, suffered the torment of an aggressive breast cancer that ravaged her body in Charlottenburg. In August came another telegram. Her second son, Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, was dead, his life consumed by throat cancer after years of heavy drinking and smoking. Victoria wept bitterly, writing, "Oh God, my poor darling Alfie gone too, my third grown-up child." Before she could recover, more calamity. Her grandson, Prince Christian Victor, died of fever in South Africa, his young body wasted on the battlefield. And as the year closed, her lifelong friend and confidant, Lady Jane Churchill, was found lifeless in her bed at Osborne itself. The sequence of blows was merciless. By the winter of 1900, the Queen's body bore the marks of grief as much as of age. Her appetite diminished. She grew thin and ghost-like. Once a commanding presence, she now relied on a wheelchair to move about. Her eyesight dimmed, and her mind slipped into confusion. At 81, even by Victorian standards, she had surpassed the natural span of life. Yet still her children could not, or would not, imagine her end. They avoided the subject, pretended her weakness was temporary, and failed to make the practical preparations that a monarch's death required. Victoria herself, however, was not blind to her decline. In her diary, she wrote with resignation, "Another year begun. I am feeling so weak and unwell that I enter upon it sadly." She knew what her family dared not acknowledge. Her reign was closing. By January 1901, her sanctuary at Osborne became the stage for the final act. Sir James Reid, her longtime physician, saw the truth with brutal clarity. He warned the family that the Queen's condition was beyond recovery. But his words were met with denial. Princess Helena and Princess Beatrice clung desperately to hope, speaking of their mother's illness as if it were a passing cold. Even as Victoria drifted into delirium, they insisted that life continue as normal. The family's refusal created tension and delay. Some members hesitated to even travel to Osborne. The Prince of Wales grumbled at having to cancel weekend engagements. The Duke of Connaught was still in Berlin at celebrations of the Prussian monarchy's bicentenary. Others were at the theater when the summons came. Only when Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria's grandson, was telegraphed by Sir James did the wider royal circle grasp the gravity of the moment. Wilhelm cancelled his festivities and rushed to England, his arrival forcing the family to admit publicly what they had concealed. The Queen was dying. News traveled swiftly. Headlines screamed, "Queen unconscious, sinking fast." Crowds gathered outside Osborne's gates. Yet confusion reigned. The press had never reported a monarch's deathbed before, and rumors mixed with false reassurances. Some newspapers even claimed she was recovering. Inside the palace, Victoria herself seemed to cling to that illusion. At one point, she asked her doctor almost pleadingly, "Am I getting better? I should like to live a little longer, as I have a few things to settle." Sir James, unwilling to crush her fragile hope, answered gently that she was indeed improving. But it was a brief reprieve. On January 17th, she suffered a series of strokes. Paralysis crept in. Her speech slurred. Government business halted. There was even talk of her son Edward briefly assuming the regency, so incapable was she of performing her duties. Osborne filled with arrivals, anxious children, grandchildren, courtiers, clergymen. The telephone rang constantly with journalists demanding updates. Outside, the nation held its breath. And in her darkened bedroom, beneath the heavy drapes, Queen Victoria lingered. The grandmother of Europe, once the symbol of stability, now reduced to a frail figure, drifting between moments of lucidity and silence. The room at Osborne grew heavy with anticipation. Ministers, bishops, and the Queen's descendants paced the halls, waiting for the inevitable. Victoria herself, though increasingly clouded by illness, seemed to sense the gathering storm. Her lips murmured faint prayers. At times she whispered simply, "I am very ill." Sir James Reid, ever by her bedside, squeezed her hand and offered soft reassurances. But the truth was clear to all who dared look. The end approached. As the shadows lengthened in January, the Queen's chamber became a place of ritual farewells. Her children and grandchildren were summoned one by one to kiss her hand, some unable to contain their tears, others clinging to composure. The Bishop of Winchester and the rector of Whippingham Parish kept vigil, their voices rising in hymns that floated through the corridors. And beside her for hours at a time sat her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ruler of Germany, yet here only a grieving boy at his grandmother's side. On January 22nd, as the winter sun sank, Queen Victoria's long life drew to its close. Surrounded by the family who had once refused to believe she could die, she exhaled her final breath. She was 81. The reign that had lasted more than 6 decades, a span so immense that no Briton under 70 could remember another sovereign, ended in silence at Osborne House. News spread like wildfire. A simple notice pinned to the gates of Osborne announced the death, and the great machinery of empire jolted into mourning. In London, newspapers rushed out special editions. Bells tolled at St. Paul's Cathedral. Across the capital, shop windows were draped in black, and the people themselves clothed their bodies in mourning. The age of Victoria was over, but her passing unleashed chaos. Britain had not buried a monarch in so long that the rituals of a state funeral were rusty, half forgotten. Worse, Victoria's own wishes confounded protocol. She demanded a full military funeral, not a hushed religious rite. She forbade embalming, insisting her body remain untouched. She refused to lie in state. And instead of black draperies, she wanted white. Her coffin drawn by white ponies, her body clad in the gown she had worn as a bride. At Osborne, the confusion deepened. The royal undertaker, summoned hastily from London, arrived without a coffin, forcing a local craftsman to build one for Britain's longest reigning monarch. Sir James Reid oversaw the preparations with the Queen's dresser, Mrs. Tuck, at his side. They honored the Queen's unusual requests. Charcoal was scattered at the coffin's base to ward off odor. Victoria was dressed in a white silk gown, the blue ribbon and star of the garter pinned proudly to her breast, her wedding veil drawn over her face. Then came a secret ritual, one she had confided only to those closest to her. Into the coffin went small tokens of her private life: a lock of hair, a ring. Most startling of all, the wedding ring of John Brown, the Scottish servant whose intimacy with Victoria had scandalized the court, was slipped onto her finger. It was a gesture of defiance against convention, a final reminder that behind the throne, Victoria had been a woman of fierce attachments and private rebellions. When the coffin was ready, her sons and grandsons lifted her body inside, King Edward VII, the Kaiser, the Duke of Connaught, each pausing for a last farewell. Then the lid was sealed, and the Queen's chamber, once filled with whispers of denial, fell silent. But outside Osborne, the world was anything but calm. The funeral procession was set to be the largest Britain had seen since the Duke of Wellington's burial nearly half a century earlier. Soldiers lined the roads. Regiments from across the empire prepared to march. And when the cortege crossed the Solent by ship, crowds pressed to the shoreline, straining for a glimpse of the coffin that bore their queen. The ceremony in London was grand, but far from flawless. The sheer size of the procession led to near disaster when the coffin nearly slipped from its carriage. At Windsor, things went awry once more. Archbishops arrived too early, naval contingents failed to appear, and St. George's Chapel was only half filled. Courtiers scrambled to invite more guests at the last minute. Even in death, Victoria's reign defied easy order. Still, as the service concluded, the nation bowed its head, and then the coffin moved one final time to Frogmore, the mausoleum she had built beside the resting place of Albert, the husband whose memory had haunted her for 40 years. There, the Queen was laid to rest beside him, the sovereign who had ruled an empire buried simply as a wife beside her beloved. Her family lingered in grief. Kaiser Wilhelm, who had ordered a death mask against her wishes, clashed with relatives who found the gesture offensive. The Duke of York fell gravely ill, further disrupting the mourning court. Yet amidst the chaos, the burial closed the curtain on the Victorian age. For the people, the moment was almost incomprehensible. Victoria had reigned across an era of iron and steam, empire and industry, faith and doubt. To them, she had seemed immovable, a fixture as permanent as the monarchy itself. But now she was gone, and the 20th century, with all its uncertainties, had begun. The death of Queen Victoria was not just the passing of a monarch. It was the collapse of a symbol that had bound an empire together. For 63 years, she had stood as the matriarch of a nation, the grandmother of Europe, the figure whose presence seemed to anchor a turbulent century. Now that anchor was gone, and with it came questions of what Britain would become in a new century. Her reign had been more than ceremonial. She had presided over the height of the Industrial Revolution, when iron rails, steamships, and telegraphs reshaped daily life. She had lent her name to an age of invention and empire, an era in which Britain stretched its reach across continents. She was proclaimed Empress of India, her face stamped on coins and monuments from Cape Town to Calcutta. To many, she embodied stability in an age of dizzying change. Yet the woman herself had always been more complex than the myth. Victoria had been passionate, opinionated, sometimes even stubborn. She withdrew into years of shadowed mourning after Albert's death, wearing black for the rest of her life and turning Windsor into a shrine of grief. She relied heavily on servants and intimates, first John Brown, then Abdul Karim, relationships that drew whispers and resentment from the court. She was both revered and criticized, adored by millions, yet often accused of aloofness. Her death revealed the contradiction of her reign, an empire that seemed unshakable, yet a family riven by quarrels, jealousies, and denial. Even in her final hours, her children refused to confront reality until forced by circumstance. And even in her funeral, disorder intruded, a reflection that the order of empire was always more fragile than it appeared. For her son, Edward VII, the moment was daunting. He was already nearly 60, long overshadowed by his mother, long dismissed as frivolous. Now he inherited the throne of the world's most powerful empire at a time of war and uncertainty. The Edwardian era would prove brief, a glittering but unstable bridge between Victorian solidity and the storms of the 20th century. For the British people, mourning was not only grief, but identity. They wore black, filled churches, and lined the streets to watch the cortege pass. The sheer scale of the funeral procession, its 2-hour march of soldiers and banners, was not merely respect for a monarch, but a farewell to the age she had defined. The empire had buried not just its queen, but its certainty. In the mausoleum at Frogmore, the story closed. There, beneath marble domes and solemn statuary, Victoria rested beside Albert at last. In life, she had called herself his widow. In death, she became his eternal companion. The queen who had lived half a century in mourning ended her reign in the embrace of the one she had never ceased to love. The image of Victoria, stern-faced in portraits, veiled in black, the sovereign who seemed eternal, was always part illusion. In truth, she was human, fragile, wounded, capable of despair, capable of affection that defied convention. Her death stripped away the myth, leaving behind the reality of a woman who had shaped a century, even as she struggled with her own griefs and weaknesses. And yet, it was precisely that mixture of grandeur and frailty that made her reign unforgettable. The Victorian age was never simply about industry or empire, but about the paradox of appearances, the performance of stability masking the undercurrents of sorrow, conflict, and change. On that cold January evening in 1901, as the bells tolled and the empire wept, the world learned a truth it had long denied. Even the longest reign ends, even the strongest symbol fades, even the eternal queen must fall silent.